Not many people get their names stamped on history, but Giacomo Girolamo Casanova wasn't like most people. Born in the hedonistic capital of the world, Casanova adventured his way across Europe for decades, and wherever he went, people remembered his name. But while his playful escapades are the stuff of legends, there was a chilling darkness to this debaucherous figure. As a young man, a friend told Casanova that he was bound to pay the price for his depraved lifestyle eventually. Casanova laughed him off, unaware that his friend's words would come true in the most gruesome way possible, which we'll get into a bit later. Anyone who knows an actor will tell you they're a different breed. It should be no surprise, then, that the infamous Casanova's parents made their living on stage. Gaetano Casanova and Zanetta Ferrucci ended up having 6 children, with her Giacomo being the first. Though Casanova traveled all over Europe, his name was synonymous with one city, Venice. There was no better town for him to call home either. While Paris was sleek and romantic, Venice was about one thing: partying. Though the ruling class was honestly quite prudish and conservative, they tolerated their city's vices and raked in the cash hand over fist because of it. Venice was the pleasure capital of Europe, and young men from all over the continent would make the pilgrimage there to party, gamble, and visit the city's legendary cat houses. In that hothouse of debauchery and sin, Casanova was born. Though Casanova had a huge family, it wasn't really a happy one. His parents were far more interested in the glamour of the stage than they were in, parenting. They dumped Casanova off with his grandmother while they trapezed off across Europe. If you saw the womanizing, gambling, degenerate man Casanova became, you might think, that guy probably didn't have a strong father figure in his life. Well, you'd be right. His father abandoned him for the road, then went and croaked when Casanova was just 8 years old. Then, as if the little rake didn't have enough problems, he began to suffer from chronic nosebleeds. But don't you worry, his grandmother had a sinister plan to cure him. His grandmother brought him through the maze of canals to his small hovel. Just a boy, he entered to find a withered old woman sitting on a pallet. She had a black cat in her hands, and 6 more wandered throughout the small room. The witch performed a mysterious incantation over Casanova before applying a pungent salve to his nose. She promised his nosebleeds would trouble him no further. The boy and his grandmother left in awe. Did it really matter that his nosebleeds came back almost immediately? Not to Casanova, it didn't. He couldn't care less that the witch's spell hadn't worked. He was completely enthralled by her. Thus began his lifelong obsessions with magic and the occult, something that would find him in no end of trouble before long. A doctor believed that Venice's dense air caused his nosebleeds, so his family shipped him off to a boarding house on the mainland of Padua. His mother had abandoned him for the road. Now she'd essentially kicked him out of the house. Casanova never forgot about it, unable to hide his bitterness even in his memoirs, written decades later. Certainly, the horrific conditions in the boarding house didn't help matters either. Casanova was miserable to leave his beloved Venice for a boarding house on the mainland. He was even more miserable when he arrived and saw the squalid building that was meant to be his new home. But here's the thing about Giacomo Casanova. When the going got tough, he found a way to talk himself out of it. His parents had hired a man named Abe Gozzi as his tutor in Padua. Casanova begged Gozzi to take him in, and the man fell for his charms hook, line, and sinker. Gozzi's place wasn't a palace, but it was a whole lot better than the boarding house. It was also where Casanova discovered his greatest vice. While under Gozzi's care, though only 11 years old, Casanova had his first experience with a woman. In his memoirs, Casanova recalled Gozzi's younger sister Bettina fondling him while he was still just a boy. He'd later look back on that day with delight, and it formed an obsession with Bettina that lasted for his entire life. However, it also might help explain the sinister impulses that hang over Casanova's complicated legacy like a storm cloud. but those come later. For now, Casanova's guardians tried their best to make an honest, upstanding citizen out of a young man. Clearly, they failed miserably. Anyone who knew the young Casanova quickly realized he was brilliant. Gazzi got him into the University of Padua at age 12, and he graduated at 17 with a law degree. His family and Gazzi both hoped he was destined for a fine, respectable life as a clerical lawyer. He certainly had the smarts for it, but there's a reason you don't think of a lawyer when you hear the name Casanova. The kid was smart, but he learned two important things at university. 1, he absolutely hated law. 2, he loved gambling. Neither one helped him very much as he grew older. Casanova's gambling while at school eventually got so bad that his grandmother had to drag him back to Venice to get him away from the negative influence of his fellow students, and his addiction would see him fluctuate from rags to riches over and over throughout his life. So, which would come first? As a teenager, Casanova found work as a clerical law clerk in Venice while finishing his degree. He was also growing into a young man with a taste for the finer things in life. You definitely wouldn't miss him on the streets with his tall frame, handsome features, and long hair. Even as a teen, Casanova was the kind of guy of whom people took notice, and thankfully for him, some of those people had some seriously deep pockets. If Casanova was good at anything, it was getting people to give him money. He got started during his second stint in Venice, ingratiating himself with a wealthy patron, an elderly senator named Alvise Gaspero Malipiero. Malipiero lived in one of the city's finest palaces, and in Venice. That was saying something. Malipiero funded many of Casanova's earliest adventures. Casanova fascinated the old man, and he helped teach this burgeoning libertine about high society. Casanova became well-versed in fine spirits, gourmet food, and the complicated web of manners and behavior expected among Venice's upper crust. Yet, of course, since this is Casanova we're talking about, he managed to screw it all up in the most scandalous way possible. The senator caught Casanova fooling around with an actress he himself had an eye on, and he flipped out. He kicked both of them out of his palace, and just like that, Casanova had lost his cash cow. It wasn't even like Casanova had slept with his patron's crush, because he was actually still a virgin at that point. But wouldn't you know it, that was about to change. Casanova lost his V-card in the most Casanova way imaginable. His first physical experience with a woman was with two women, and they were sisters. Years later, Casanova wrote that his experience with those two sisters convinced him his purpose in life was to sleep with as many women as possible. But wait, wasn't he technically a cleric? Aren't those two things kinda incompatible? Being a cleric was maybe the worst profession possible for Casanova. The second worst? Probably military officer. Yet he still gave it a shot. However, he didn't enlist out any sense of patriotism or valor. Nope, he just loved the uniforms. He ended up stationed at Corfu, but the only moments he didn't hate were when he gambled away his pay-playing cards with his fellow officers. Pretty soon, he couldn't take it anymore. He flat-out abandoned his post and returned to Venice. He even had an idea for a new career path, one that was definitely more up his alley. No, Casanova didn't set out to become a gigolo. He wanted to be a professional gambler. There was just one problem. Turns out, the guy couldn't win a bet to save his life. Upon his return to Venice, he almost instantly lost all the money he'd saved up. But Casanova never made his money by gambling. He made it by schmoozing with rich old men, and that's just what he did next. He reconnected with an old patron, and they even helped him get a new gig. Show business was in his blood, so after 3 failed careers, 4 if you're counting gambling, Casanova decided to give it a go. He started performing as a violinist, but don't go picturing him as some rock star. There's one thing musicians in Casanova's day had in common with those of today. They loved to party, But drinking and women were only one part of the equation. Let's not forget about the pranks. Mischief and merrymaking were the name of the game for Casanova at this point in his life. What he did next then must have surprised even him. Casanova found himself on the gondola with yet another rich senator. Suddenly, disaster struck. The man suffered a stroke and collapsed. The doctor tried their best, but the senator seemed to be at death's door. That's when Casanova sprang into action. Casanova started barking orders. Did he know what he was doing? Not really, but even in his youth, Casanova could project confidence. So the men listened to him. Then, to everyone's shock, the senator actually recovered. The senator invited him into his home and became his lifelong patron. The poor old man had no idea what he was in for. Then, a new chilling accusation came out against Casanova. A young woman went to the local authorities and accused Casanova of a non-consensual encounter. In Casanova's retelling, the accusation was all part of a con she was playing on him. Certainly, the authorities took the accusation extremely seriously, and Casanova fled Venice. Thus far, nearly all of Casanova's affairs had been fleeting things. When he fled to Parma, he found the lasting he ever expected. A woman who made him feel like a fool. A French woman we know only as Henriette became the most passionate love of his life. She was beautiful, brilliant, and cultured. For the first time, Casanova met a woman he judged his superior. You know how we know Henriette was smart? She saw right through Casanova's masks for the depraved rogue that he was. Though she had her fun with him, she realized he was no man to settle down with. She wasn't about to end up in poverty, attached to some degenerate gambler. She snuck around with Casanova for a while, then dropped him like a sack of hammers. For Casanova, it was the lowest point of his life. But don't you worry, he could sink so much lower. After moping around Venice for a time, he saved up enough money to set off on a grand tour of Europe. Finally, Casanova made it to France, where he quickly set off down a new dark path. In Lyons, France, Casanova discovered Freemasonry. He still loved the occult, dating all the way back to that witch from his childhood. He also loved rich and powerful people whom he could dupe into giving him money. The Freemasons were bursting with both. He quickly rose through the ranks and became a master mason. The Masons helped Casanova infiltrate the upper echelons of French society, just like he had back home. Casanova stayed in France for 2 years, where he continued to live off wealthy patrons. But, in case you haven't been paying attention, as long as Casanova had money to party, he was going to cross the line sooner or later. Once 2 years were up, the Parisian authorities knew him well. Countless complaints would see to that. They were just waiting for a chance to lock up the lascivious libertine. Casanova fled Paris with law enforcement hot on his heels. Next, Casanova ended up reuniting with his mother, brother, and sister in Dresden. But life in Dresden was too boring for Casanova. The steamy canals of Venice called him back, and against his better judgment, he listened. Casanova managed to return to Venice with a clean slate, but he quickly dirtied it up again. Blasphemy, obscenity, adultery, fighting. Casanova's record with law enforcement grew longer with each passing day. Pretty soon, those in charge tried to get him off the streets once and for all. Venetian authorities could put up with a lot, but Casanova, the occultist, philandering, predatory Freemason, found their limit. They hired a state spy to dig up any dirt on him. Obviously, the man didn't have to look very hard. Casanova's remarkable streak of evading the law was about to end. Casanova went to prison for the first time at age 30. That's right. Everything we've covered here took place before he turned 30. Authorities charged him with an affront to religion and common decency, citing his public outrages as evidence. They locked him up in the Doge's palace to await sentencing. He sat and prayed that one of his many rich friends might come to save him. They did not. 5 years imprisonment. For a man like Casanova, that was an eternity. What adventure his life would be complete without a daring prison escape? Casanova used an iron bar to dig a hole in his cell's floor for weeks, planning his escape. Just before he could flee, guards moved him to a new cell, ruining his plan. He adapted, smuggling the bar, escaping with a fellow inmate through the ceiling. They then commandeered a gondola and got the heck out of there. Forced to flee Venice for the second time, Casanova made his way back to Paris. There, he planned his greatest scheme yet. In Paris, Casanova helped found the first-ever state lottery. The plan was brilliant. The consummate salesman, Casanova sold countless tickets. Some of the money went to the winner, some went to the state, and Casanova got the rest. Not only did this make him a rich man once more, the government now had every reason to turn a blind eye to his constant scandals, as long as he was bringing in the cash. Once again, Casanova was living the high life, and once again, he just couldn't help screw it up for himself. He found himself behind bars over gambling debts once again. He only stayed locked up for 4 days, but once he got out, he heard that his most powerful patron had a falling out with the king, Louis XV. Casanova was out of money and out of favors, and his enemies smelled blood in the water. Paris was too dangerous, and since he didn't want to end up in another dark, flea-infested cell, he got the heck out of there. He sold all his belongings and fled to Germany. There, he lost that money and ran away to Switzerland before the authorities caught up with him. In Switzerland, Casanova actually considered becoming, get this, a monk, but he eventually reverted back to his old womanizing self and abandoned all plans of a monastic life. Casanova returned to Paris, determined to keep his head low, but he just couldn't help himself. He convinced one of his patrons, the elderly Marquis Dufay, that he could use the dark arts to turn her into a young man. I'm not quite sure what he was thinking, though. In the end, Marquis did not turn into an old man, and she lost all faith in him. She cut him off, and suddenly, without her money, Paris lost its appeal. Next stop, London town. Being one of the few places in Europe he hadn't haunted, Casanova set sail for England in 1763, hoping to pull his lottery scam there. He still chased women as doggedly before, but he couldn't actually speak English, so he came up with a rather unsettling plan to get his fix. Since he couldn't use the gift of gab to woo women, Casanova tried something else. He put out an ad in the local newspaper to rent out his apartment. When any young woman arrived to inquire, he seduced them. According to his memoirs, he found many lovers this way, including Miss Pauline, one of the most passionate affairs since Henriette. But while, as always, his memoirs painted his trysts as consensual, hedonistic affairs. I can't be the only one who thinks the man luring women to his apartment under false pretenses to seduce them might not be telling the whole truth. Catfishing aside, England was not kind to Casanova, and he quickly gambled through the little funds he'd gathered by selling his patron stuff. Plus, he was getting older, and just like his old mentor had said, he was starting to pay the price for his scandalous lifestyle. He suffered from Lord knows how many venereal diseases, and they were starting to eat away at his once dashing frame. But not even that could slow Casanova down. He ventured from country to country trying to sell people on his lottery scheme. But he wasn't the handsome, charismatic man he'd once been. Wherever he went, people eventually ran him out of town, be it after a near-fatal duel in Warsaw or a failed assassination attempt in Spain. Then, finally, the moment he'd been waiting for arrived. He received word that his record had been expunged and that he could return to Venice. After 18 years in exile, Casanova was returning home. At first, Casanova enjoyed what felt like a triumphant return to Venice. He spent years writing about his escapades, and he'd become a local celebrity. Even the inquisitors asked him to regale them with the tale of how he'd escaped their prison. But Casanova soon realized that something was different about Venice. It wasn't the same den of sin that he left all those years ago. Soon after returning to Venice, Casanova heard of his mother's passing. They'd never been close, but the loss still affected him. However, the worst tragedy was soon to follow. Bettina Gazzi, the woman who'd first introduced him to carnal pleasure all those decades ago, was not long for this world. Casanova rushed to her bedside, where she'd end up dying in his arms. In his 20s, Casanova lit up any room he entered. By age 49, that jovial young man was gone. Smallpox scars and sunken cheeks marred the once handsome face. Venereal diseases left him weak as a kitten. He no longer had the money for gambling and couldn't charm his way through glamorous parties anymore. He became irritable and strange. One friend described him as having a ferocious air. Casanova spent his final years in Bohemia, modern-day Czech Republic, at yet another patron's castle. However, he felt as miserable there as he had in Venice. His new patron was even stranger than he, often refusing to speak to him for days at a time. The locals also couldn't stand this grotesque, paranoid Italian who invaded their castle. However, no matter how miserable he was, he had nowhere else to go. By some miracle, Casanova made it to age 73. The raucous days of his youth had long since ended, and he had faded from public memory. He passed in such obscurity that we still have no idea where his grave is. All that remained of his scandalous youth were his memoirs and the hearts he broke along the way. Sex wasn't just a passion for Casanova. It was a full-on sport. Just sleeping with someone wasn't enough for him. He needed the drama. Like an 18th-century version of the Dennis system, he perfected a formula for his ideal affair. Act 1. Find a beautiful woman with a jealous lover. Act 2. Play the hero. Save her from the brute and seduce her. Act 3. Get bored with her and set her up with another man, maybe even the one she'd been with in the first place. Act 4. Skip town and start again. In Casanova's writings, he always paints his lovers as willing, but the truth is almost certainly much darker. For starters, he almost exclusively targeted young, insecure, and emotionally vulnerable women, telling them anything they wanted to hear if it meant they would sleep with him. He and a group of men also certainly assaulted one woman at Carnival, though Casanova had to share arrogance to proclaim their victim was willing. While many of the stories about him portrayed these relationships as consensual and romantic, the truth is far more disturbing. In St. Petersburg, at 40 years old, he purchased a 12-year-old girl as his slave. 10 years later, he assaulted the daughter of one of his former lovers. Today, Casanova may imply a great lover of women, but the real man himself, for all his charm and bravado, was a predator, plain and simple. Unsurprisingly, Casanova fathered too many illegitimate children to keep count. This got dangerous in 1761 when he claims he almost took a woman named Leonilda as his mistress. Just before he brought her into his bedroom, he found out that she was actually his daughter and pulled back from the affair. But the worst wasn't over. Years later, Casanova visited them again. Leonilda's mother revealed that their daughter had married, yet her husband couldn't have children. That's when she made a shocking request. She begged Casanova to impregnate his own daughter, and he actually did it. That's right, if we are to believe his writings, Casanova fathered his own grandson. If you've enjoyed these stories, don't forget to show some love by hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel. Stay tuned because we'll be back with more incredible narratives soon. Thanks for joining us today, and until next time.